Welcome to a series of discussions about advocacy for people with disability. My name is Bob Lee and I'm here with John Armstrong, who as an advocate, a board member, an evaluator and trainer has had the benefit of visiting many programs around the world that have done advocacy. So welcome, John.
Thank you, Bob.
Can we start with a very basic question? Can you give us an idea about your understanding of exactly what advocacy is?
Well, that's a pretty good question because advocacy as a word gets bandied around by a lot of people. They say, I advocate for this or that. And so it's a commonly used word and in some ways is losing its meaning a little bit as we might use it specific to the issues surrounding advocating for another person and on behalf of. So it's usually associated with some action, speaking, acting, writing, a kind of doing something for the sincerely understood benefit of someone else. And therefore doing something that positions the person to be more favourable in the eyes of a third party. And so it's usually involving then the advocate, the person that they're, or party that they're interested in, or the issue that they're interested in, and then representing that interest powerfully, vigorously to another party that has hoped that that advocacy will influence towards a certain direction.
So how does advocacy respond to the different needs that people with disability might have?
I think a lot of advocacy is done in a really natural way. Parents who advocate for their kids with a school teacher or principal. Our advocacy towards a doctor to get a second opinion. Those kind of things we might say are quite informal and kind of everyday and natural. But some people are in circumstances where they need a little bit more help, and we now have a kind of process we use called self-advocacy, where we assist people to speak up on their own behalf. We might rehearse with them the kind of issues, attending a meeting, going for a job, making a complaint and seeing it through and knowing how to voice that themselves. And so that's a very good scheme that helps people, as it were, advocate for themselves, to learn to speak up and be understood and appreciated in that regard. And there are lots of movements that do that. For other people, there's an advocacy form where the advocacy is on their behalf. You might say that their ability to see and understand the issues that they face and to speak up on their behalf is weakened in some way. And in that respect then that we speak up on their behalf quite vigorously, but in a sense representing their own voice, representing their needs, that idea of sincerely understanding the needs of another party, another person, and representing that interest to someone else who doesn't get that. And so this is an interesting form of advocacy because it tries to resolve problems that the person themselves may be unable to resolve themselves. And that's a long-term issue. And they often represent people who are also devalued. That is, their status in the eyes of other people is seen as very low indeed. So who takes notice of that person? And so this advocacy is on that behalf, that is not just an episodic kind of devaluation, but people who are very likely to be devalued for all or much of their life stand to be very vulnerable to being controlled and moved about and their relationships controlled, their finances controlled. And here therefore need a kind of vigorous advocacy that can speak up on their behalf and be able to represent that. And so some of these then are formal kind of ideas. Sometimes they're appeals to the system, and sometimes they're forms of advocacy that are kind of to the situation that they're in, the service, the doctor, the transport service, some representation of that person's interest. Of course, a very effective form of advocacy is to know how vulnerable a person is in advance, and therefore to do some things in advance of a situation arising and to prevent things happening before they happen. So rather than be only concerned with crisis or complaint, they get to respond in advance to a situation that's likely to arise if no action occurred at all. So this is kind of preempting a situation and acting in advance, understanding this person is vulnerable to these kind of bad things happening, and there's a high probability that these will happen. Therefore, I can do some things right now to ensure that that doesn't take place. And that's a very exciting and a kind of form of advocacy that has great insight because it brings a thorough knowledge of the person that they're there to represent.
People sometimes think that advocacy is just about reacting to a situation where something goes wrong. But as you noted before, an important function of advocacy is actually a preventative role. So how does an advocate go about taking action that prevents bad things happening to people with disability?
Well, you're quite right. We can be drawn into just responding and reacting when things occur, but sometimes our advocacy is towards people who we should have been aware that things can go wrong in an instant and begin to predict the kind of things that put a person at particular risk. So our knowledge of the person is really critical. What are the things that tend to place this person at some degree of risk, whether it's a health risk, whether it's a reputational risk, and therefore kind of things that act in a preliminary way. And it's interesting, it's one of the areas, Bob, that in the life of many people, whether it's their services or their workers, there's a kind of reluctance to acknowledge the existence of a vulnerability, a susceptibility to things going bad, and going bad in an instant where people might lose their homes or decisions get made that, you can't stay there anymore, and things can change overnight. And so advocates become very wary about this, their identification with people and their vulnerability to those kind of things, the control that other parties can have in their life, and therefore being really aware of those kind of things and taking advanced lines of defence with respect to that. The advocate has to be primarily loyal to the person they represent, and it's through their independence that the potency of what they've got and the vigour of their action, if need be, is demonstrated because they've got no other tie. This is one of the things, many staff members have good hearts and can see that things aren't right for people, but the very fact that they're employed by an employer that may be the target of the advocacy compromises their ability. No, they need the job. They're paying off a mortgage. So you can see how that would readily compromise the vigour of their advocacy. They see the need for it, but they're not able to act and speak out because, well, I could lose my job and that's the end of that. That is, they can easily be got at. An independent advocate can't easily be got at, if at all. And that means you can't shut down this voice. This question of independence allows the advocate then to be as vigorous as necessary. And what's interesting is that their independence is seen by other parties as well. Other parties know that this advocate could go to the minister, could go to the media, could go as far as they needed to go to resolve this issue. That is, there's no other form of loyalty that they owe to any party that would, as it were, compromise their vigour. And so it's not that they have to do all of that, it's just that they could, that gives the potency to the advocate. And often the other parties know that. You want strength in your corner, and you don't want someone representing you who's got a tie to the very person that they're appealing to. There's a divided loyalty, a kind of conflict of interest that just destroys the effectiveness of advocacy.
Unfortunately, we hear regularly in the media about instances where people with disability are treated badly or even abused. What is it that makes some people with disability vulnerable to being neglected and abused?
Fascinating question, and such a worry for us. It's like the dark side of human nature. Under what conditions do people start to treat others badly? And we find that there are a set of conditions that, in a sense, position people with disabilities and sometimes other vulnerable people like children, we hear about all the time, children in care and so on. And so we've got these terrible stories. What they do reveal, of course, is that most abuse has occurred in secret. And so whenever we've got vulnerable people being supported alone, then it opens up that potential that abuse might be around. It's very easy, you might say, for a pattern of neglect to grow into a pattern of abuse, and largely because it's in secret. And so an advocate might even have a position that there's a high likelihood that the person I'm representing here will be abused, and therefore to be very alert to the potential for that not to be kind of Pollyanna-ish, oh no, people aren't like that anymore. Yes, they are. And this is a particular group of people who often can't represent themselves, may not be able to speak of abuse. You only see indications of it. There might be very hard to bring someone to court. How would you bring evidence to bear? So all of these things allow a perpetrator, as it were, to feel like they can act with impunity and never get caught. And so a worrying trend is that many people, even some of the studies on people who will, as it were, cheat if they think they can get away with it. A high percentage, most people will, even the people who would be seen as fair and reasonable people, will cheat if they think no one knows. And so abuse is like that. And this is some of the preparation, you might say, the understanding of the vulnerability that an advocate might bring. It's also one of the reasons why advocacy is needed over the long term for people such as this, that sometimes we see just a little complaint or something that arises as being an episodic thing or something that hardly will ever happen, and therefore let's throw them an advocate that can attend a meeting with them and that'll be the end of it. And that's the outcome, and that's all we need to have happen. But we realise that here is a group of people who will go through life where various episodes of harm and abuse and neglect will almost certainly take place, virtually cyclic. And so that an advocate that is able to continue in the life of a person through the highs and lows, the ups and downs, the times of relative peace and well-being, followed by times of great upheaval and harm and worry and anxiety for people. And some of this has to do with things that can occur in an instant. So one of the difficult things that even when people experience a measure of the good things of life, home and security and well-being and able to contribute and valued roles and good health, they are still vulnerable to things going wrong in an instant, of being taken advantage of, and bad things happening, and losing their home and losing their job very quickly. And so it's a strange thing that while valued roles do protect you at one level, people who exist in heightened vulnerability will remain in a state of heightened vulnerability. It was one of the things that Wolfensberger drove home again and again. People are still vulnerable and bad things can happen in an instant. So don't let up. Don't drop your guard as an advocate. Don't believe that everything's right. She's got her own home, got a friend or two. What more can go wrong? Everything can go wrong. You've got to fight to protect that and then to keep it.
So the job of an advocate is really to stay involved over the long term to make sure that things don't happen.
That's right. And sometimes when an advocate really discovers those situations for people, it keeps them engaged. But initially they may need some help to stay engaged as their relationship develops, as they begin to see with insight and with clearer eyes, what is this person up against? And many advocates report that when they really get to know that, they had no idea that life could be like this for people. That people get treated in ways that they've never seen or experienced before. And it's like a revelation, like, she doesn't get the kind of things that I've experienced. And I've never had to deal with the kind of things she deals with on a daily basis. When that realization occurs for an advocate, the penny drops. She needs me and I need to stay here. And that too fuels that vigour, fuels that loyalty, fuels that independence, and to not let anything happen. And it's quite a wonderful revelation where the advocate now can appreciate the needs of the person themselves. No longer needs a person like a citizen advocacy coordinator to kind of interpret that for them. That might have been an initial state. They get this. And they realise then, I can't stand by and allow this to happen any longer. And so you get this action arising, which is quite wonderful. But the vulnerability never fades.
Advocates expect that they will need to speak up on someone's behalf, and they're prepared to do that. However, I've noticed that often just the presence of an advocate in the life of a vulnerable person with disability can have a real impact on what's happening for that person.
Absolutely, Bob. And sometimes that comes as a surprise to the advocate as well. It's wonderful when you're in trouble to have someone in your corner, but when that someone is also someone of high standing, that is, they're valued, that is, they have competencies that they bring and they're standing to represent you. And also the knowledge that this person could go as far as they need to go to get a matter heard, and that that's not limited, that's not constrained in any way. It means that they don't necessarily have to say anything, but they could, and they will if they need to. That really bothers some authorities. As I said earlier too, that when abuse occurs because it's done in secret, that is, no one else knows. In a situation where an advocate turns up, now someone else knows, and therefore the person isn't there to try and represent their own interests by themselves, which is often very inadequate. A kind of voiceless person may not be able to articulate things as they need to, or even be able to speak, and therefore things and all sorts of decisions can be made without regard for how the person feels or their response to that. And therefore to have someone who represents that person's interests as though those interests were their own, who can articulate it and put it in a manner that represents that person powerfully to the eyes of others, means now that they can't go and do what they were planning to do with impunity. In a sense, the genie's out of the bottle. We know what's going on here, and that's no longer a secret. And therefore the strength of the advocacy is in the potency of the advocate to speak up on those sorts of things. In a sense, you need the strongest to represent the interests of the weakest. So if we were all in trouble, we'd want, the best lawyer we could afford in our corner, the one with the greatest standing. You wouldn't necessarily want to go to someone who was, just thrown out of the law courts and, unregistered. And, you'd want someone who has credibility, an authority to speak on your behalf. And therefore an advocate, and their authority comes from their knowledge of the person. The fact that they may be the only person that knows this person really well. So there are two major benefits that the presence of an advocate brings, not only to these parties that are being advocated to, but directly to the person themselves. And the two benefits are that this relationship now, this long-term relationship that grows into a friendship, is the vehicle from the devalued world to the valued world. It's the bridge across those kind of things. And it's also the thing that helps prevent this person with a disability, being made dead. Those two things are so potent that someone who's going to say, I'm not going to let you do that to him again. You will deal with me if you do, sends a very strong message that is usually missing. The vast number of people in services go on largely unrepresented, and therefore can be moved about, can be treated without that sense of someone else representing their interests. And so this is a very potent method of protecting the welfare of people, and especially those people who no longer have parents in their lives, other siblings, other people that might represent their interests, are kind of completely alone in the world, but now have someone who has a commitment to staying with them and being in their corner and nobody else's.
Well, advocates take on a variety of roles in their involvement with a vulnerable person with disability, and these reflect the variety of needs that a person with disability might have. Sometimes advocates might take on several roles at once. Can you comment on this?
It's an interesting dance, you might say. We in all our relationships, we often have a starting point, and then it evolves. And I think these kind of long-term committed advocacy relationships have some of those same features, that there's an urgent need we might start with, and we think this is perhaps where all we need to do, but then we discover more. And so our role might depend on the manner in which we see the needs of the person, our accuracy about seeing the needs and vulnerability of another person, and therefore the role we need to play. Certainly some of the roles are very, what we call instrumental. They're really practical. There are things that need to be done, secure a tenancy agreement, or, secure better food for someone, look at a different or better service for someone. So they're kind of, a better doctor that will listen to the person. So all sorts of kind of practical things. So they're kind of little basket of instrumental needs. And then there's this other basket that has more to do with our relationship, the impact that this relationship brings to the person being wanted and needed and belonging and companionship. And so some people have needs there very much so, and we'll see the advocate as an important feature of their relational life, and that directly meets a need around that. And so between those two things, there's a multitude of roles that an advocate might play and give emphasis to certain things. It's almost like the seasons, you might say. There's a time to do this and there's a time to do that. But there are some roles that endure. For instance, some people might start out being like a great aunt to a young woman. You know, a more mature age woman is an advocate for a younger woman. And yet other things arise and she sees that something else is needed here and therefore her role shifts. But she probably will always have that older aunt feature to the relationship, even though she's busy doing some things that aunts wouldn't necessarily need to do. So it's a kind of fluid state, and it's quite a wonderful thing when you realise the advocate begins to know the needs of the person they represent, often we call the protege, that person who's in this relationship that helps this person to flourish and for their needs to be met, and where the advocate sees those needs better than anybody else, who's got to know the person to predict their kind of the quirkiness or the unique special features of the person that mean that I understand what she really needs, and then to represent those needs so accurately to other parties who obviously sometimes have a very short-sighted or myopic view of a person, are restricted to some kind of service need area, or that she's a nuisance or her behaviour needs dealing with, compared to the advocate who sees the whole person as a unique and special and gifted person. So just a completely different way of doing that. And so that's a very special thing for an advocate to realise, that they play such a role and that they're needed, in a sense, in that relation, to know that they can't turn their back on someone who needs them so much. And so the advocate grows as well. This is a reciprocal, well, often a reciprocal relationship where the interests of both parties get met, where an advocate gets to act as a moral activist on behalf of another person. Now, who gets to do that? We often think Nelson Mandela is the only one who can be a moral activist, but when in a relationship like this, the advocate gets to be that. They'll probably never do that for themselves, but here's a chance to do it for someone else. And so when we talk to advocates, they often say, I get more out of this relationship than I think the protege does. I've learned more about life and what's important and what people's needs are and how the world can treat them. And I think I have grown here more than the protege has. We've heard, Jean Vanier, that any relationship that isn't reciprocal probably can't be sustained. This isn't just a one-way street. Advocates will get plenty from the friendship, companionship and love that their protege gives them, and not to underestimate that particular role and its part in their relationship. It's quite lovely to see.
And I suppose there's some roles that can't be taken on by paid staff, like the role of being a friend, a trusted friend, a role of being a substitute for a family member, for example.
That's right. Yes, Bob. You can't pay for care. You can't say, if I pay you a certain amount, now will you care? And certainly staff can be caring, but that's because of the heart they bring. But their paid relationship limits it. It means that their relationship is controlled by a third party. What they do, when they do it, what they say, even whether they're allowed to relate to the person beyond their service role, is all dictated by a third party. So while they might be caring and friendly and warm, they can't be a friend. Friends aren't paid. By definition, you can't be both paid and be a friend. You can be friendly. And so these are kind of confusions, you might say, that many staff have to deal with. And certainly some staff grow to love people, but their love can't be truly expressed until they step outside that paid role. Whereas in an unpaid role, you might say the two people involved are completely free to work out the dimensions of the relationship. How often will we meet? Where will we go? What we will talk about? No other third party controls that. The relationship is free. It's up to them to use that time together. They decide all of those dimensions and what they will do in it. And in that sense, the relationship is open-ended. And we've seen even advocates who say, I want this person now to live with me. I'll provide them a home. And advocates who can express love towards the protege. And they mean that in the clearest kind of dedication to each other. Whereas it would be kind of awkward to say, for staff who are paid to say, I do this because I love the people. But hang on, you're paid. What does that mean? And so it's a misunderstanding of the nature of love and the nature of that freely given commitment that needs to be made. And that's also the strength of this kind of advocacy, that it's not dependent on payment, because payment implies a coercion. Will you relate to this person if we pay you? And well, no, this relationship is too valuable to be paid for. To pay for it would diminish the value of the relationship. It's too valuable. You couldn't pay for this, and therefore it's free. There's no cost.
And it's really about relationships being one of those really important things that we mean when we talk about the good things in life.
It certainly is, yeah. And it's the things that devalued people often miss out on. Often their lives are surrounded by paid relationships. As well-meaning and as warm and caring as sometimes they are, they're limited. You know, people will inevitably leave and go and do other things, get transferred, and so that can be injuring to people when they're relying on all of their relationships through payment. It leaves them very vulnerable to the passage of what we call a relationship circus. And here's a relationship, though, where commitment is the major basis for it, and the potential then that this is long-term, even lifelong, and the kind of protective nature of that, the security that a person can have to know that there's a person in my life who will never leave me. It brings reassurance and also helps that person. It's like an insurance against the passage, the inevitable passage of paid people through their life. You can come and go, but I'll still be here and I'll never leave you. And that the person can actually deal with the passage of those paid people because, yeah, but I know that this person will always be there. So you guys can come and go. I have you. And so in a sense, that passage is not necessarily as injurious. They may miss people, but it doesn't leave the injury that a total reliance on paid relationships would otherwise bring.
So that relationship with an advocate directly reduces the dependence that some people with disability have on service systems, even though they might continue to need services, but the dependence is
absolutely.
Is
Now, there's a place for service, but now it might be discrete and it might be well targeted towards those things where a person needs, practical support to learn a new skill or get a new job, and rather than a kind of whole of life enveloping of the person, because we've got a freely given and a natural relationship that takes care of that. Of course, we would hope too that advocacy relationships widen the circle of support and friendships that people might have into the family of the advocate, into the friends and into the community that the advocate has. Welcome this person in, I want you to meet. And that means embedding people into naturally occurring valued social roles, relationship roles, community roles, and a lessening requirement that be done by paid people, which means that if service is needed, then it's well targeted and probably a whole lot cheaper.
Well, John, I'd like to thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with us, and I hope we can do this soon again.
Thank you, Bob. It's been great talking with you. Thank you.